Very good. Well, I think we will begin, and other people will just have to wait a few minutes to be admitted. A very warm welcome, first of all, to the second session in the new program of online events organized under the auspices of the Insiders Outsiders project. I won't say more about it now because I imagine most of you already know something of it. There is more to come, and I will say more about that at the very end. But today my task is to introduce you to the two participants in this session, which promises to be absolutely fascinating. I wonder, I'm very curious to know actually how many of you may have attended the session held in association with the Hungarian Cultural Centre back in July. I think it was the 23rd of July on Hallas and Batchelor, the much better known Emigré, or at least John Hallas was, Emigré filmmaking company, partnership. But Fran's task today will be to, I think, introduce many of us to much lesser known figures. And one question we might ask ourselves is, what are the reasons why Hallas and Batchelor are so much better known than the figures that Fran is going to be talking about? So, Animated Visions, as you probably know, the Emigré contribution to animation filmmaking in 1940s Britain is the official title of the session. Perhaps before introducing Jez and Fran, I should just remind you, you're all probably old hands by now. We all know that please mute yourselves for the time being, because otherwise there's the danger of noise interference. Given the numbers who've subscribed to the event and just the logistics of Zoom, we feel that it's probably best if you type in your questions in the first instance into the chat function. Again, I'm sure you all know exactly how to do that. It's sort of bottom center of your screen. It will be Jez, I will look at them as well, but Jez will be kind of fielding and moderating the Q&A afterwards. Fine, so I think let me now introduce Fran in particular. Fran Lloyd, Professor Fran Lloyd, Professor of Art History and the co-director of Kingston University's Visual and Material Culture Research Centre. Sounds very grand and splendid. She's published widely on contemporary and modern visual culture, with a particular specialism and research interest in the history, theory and practice of migrant artists in the UK. Projects that she's been involved with include the ongoing Migrant and Refugee Artists in Britain one, initiated in 2009, that focuses on artists like fleeing Nazism in Europe from the 1930s, which of course is the remit of the Insiders Outsiders project as well. And also, interestingly, on contemporary artists from the Arab world. I think an important reminder of the kind of continuing relevance of the 1930s period to the present day, albeit in very different contexts. Her research on German-speaking refugee artists and their networks include publications on the Berlin-trained Peter Sachs, who we're going to be hearing much more about, and his protege Kurt Weiler, as well as publications and exhibitions on the Viennese-born artist Ernst Eisenmeyer, and on Kurt Schwitter's, a much bigger name, I'm sure you'll agree, his work on the Isle of Man. But today her focus will be on the animation filmmakers. And Jez Stewart, who will be taking over from me in a minute and entering into conversation with Fran after her presentation. I'll keep it brief, but many of you will already perhaps know about him. He's the curator of animation at the BFI National Archive, that's to say the British Film Institute, of course, here in London. So without further ado, I think I've covered all the practicalities. I will hand over to Fran, who will screen share shortly. I would strongly advise you to make sure that you're on speaker view so that you're not sort of distracted by all the other people who are in attendance. Very good. Okay, over to Fran.
Right, thank you very much indeed. Delighted to have an opportunity to really take some new research for a walk and to see what we make of it. So this continues the dialogue that we had a few weeks ago with Hallas and Batchelor in terms of, so what I'm concentrating on today is the work of three émigrés. So Peter Sachs, who you can see on your right here, I hope, yeah? And who was really the leading animation art director at the same time as Hallas and Batchelor, and indeed, it crossed over and certainly produced and worked on some films with them. Remember, the animation world in London at this time is quite small. So he's German-born, and Peter Strausfeld, who you see there on the left, who was Cologne-based. He trained as an artist, primarily an illustrator, and again came to London. And then the third character is the character that we'd associate with the Academy Cinema in London. And this is George Hollinger, who slightly older. He was born in 1897 and died in 1980. And we would probably know him best for directing the cinema, which was a key venue for international overseas foreign films at that time. He comes into the story very much, not only because the Academy Cinema showed animation in between the major films, but because he also ran a Film Traders Limited company where his animator was a friend from internment, Peter Strausfeld, who I just showed. And Peter Strausfeld, we probably again know best from these amazing posters that he produced for the Academy Theatre, for George Hoellering, for each of the films from certainly by 1947, if not a little bit beforehand. And what's unique about these is these were done in, first sets were done in the edition of 100. They were displayed throughout the underground system in London, and they were woodcuts. And they later on produced in edition of 200, but so very precious items. And Strassfield, as we'll see in a moment, was interned with both Sachs and with Hoellering. Now, but this gives you an idea of his later work. And to give some sense of Peter Sachs, who I'm going to begin with as the sort of height of his career in the early 1950s, I wanted to show you a brief look at this, which, is it visible? No.
I think you need to screen share again, Fran.
Yeah.
Click on screen share. That's it.
Right. So what you're seeing here, Sachs was really the art director of Larkin's, W.A. Larkin's studio. And this is one of his most significant films from 1951, where it's done for the Still and I'm Foundation. And so it's very much a commercial, if you like, film, rather than one produced for cinema as such. And what you're seeing here is the way in which Sachs, using dynamic imagery, created these stunning animations that were able to evoke quickly a sense of a new, in this case, a new particular era of post-war. Now, as I've said, Sachs, Strassfield and Hoellering were all refugees from Nazi Germany, and I want to take you back now to a screen share. That's available to see online for the Iron and Steel, and you can see it's 10-minute colour animation. Where I'm going to go back to now is the earlier animations, the animations done in the early 1940s, which are very different in feel. But before I do that, I just want to give a little bit of background on each of the figures. So for Peter Sachs, I mean, he came to Britain as already an established animator. He trained in Berlin, and he'd worked with, for example, Fischinger, and also worked then with George Powell's studio, which moved to Eindhoven in the Netherlands, and Sachs joined him there with the rise of Hitler in 1933. Sachs was, he had a Lutheran mother, which actually prohibited him from working in the film industry there. So he moved with Powell to Eindhoven and produced what you can see here, quite extensive 7-minute colour. It was a new colour process, a cast colour. He was absolutely adept at trick film, so the taking shots of individual movements of these are the puppetoons that George Powell was famous for. And he was also an adept animator and paper, so that he basically worked with George Powell up until the outbreak of the war. So by the time Sachs, the Germans went into Holland, obviously, Sachs had to leave, and eventually, really quite late, managed to get in June of 1939 to the UK. I'm going to come back to his internment. He was interned, as were all of the other figures that I've just referred to. But immediately after his internment, he worked for a company called W.H. Larkins. And Larkins was, as I said, the next to Hallison Bachelor, the most important animation studio. And at the beginning, the films of W.H. Larkins that were very much headed by Sachs were short films for war effort, so like Sky Master, that's the use of animation to show pilots how to recognize certain planes. This is in the Imperial War Museum collection. And Larkin's company, that was formed in 1940, began by specializing in this. Over the years, they branched out into works like dealing with, for the Ministry of Information, really important mode of getting material over quickly to the public. And what animation offered, as we saw with Hallison Bachelor, was it offered a way of appealing to the public that were tired of information films, and in a form that was dynamic, short, brief, often humorous. And Sachs established, as the head of the Larkin studio, really his ability to be able to produce very brief but striking films. So Summer Travelling, for example, of 1945, black and white, 2 minutes, where it's dealing with actually the crowdedness on the trains during wartime and a request for the public to not to use them, really. And what we're seeing here is his ability as a drawer. It's very simple animation that we have here, but he also went on to produce other animations, like probably one of the most famous is this T for Teacher. 6 minutes now, still black and white, and this was dealing with two things, really: how to produce tea, a good pot of tea in the war climate, but also to make that appealing to the public. And the way that Sachs did that in the Larkin studio was through this very dynamic and quite modernist method of animation. So this is the kind of beginning. I'm just going to show a few sequences from this. A lot of these animations are available to be able to see on the BFI player, or you can watch them on screen through the through other channels, noticeably through British Pathé, but actually neither of those two outlets allow us to screen them for a wider audience that may be outside of the UK for different reasons. BFI, so you can watch on BFI, and you can also watch them on British Pathé on the internet quite easily. And so this is a very enchanting Sachs, where it's about the tea shop and, of course, wartime. So I'm showing you stills here from the animations of where the tea is so horrid. You have this really modernist, jagged line that Sachs uses, and he's able to create this very appealing story for a broad range of audiences. And so that's definitely a delight to see in that way. And then I just wanted to go back for a moment. Yeah. So I think you can see that you can view a lot of these on YouTube. So the themes, very much during wartime, from the bombing of 1941 of London. It's about salvage, it's about saving materials in different ways. You can see they're really short, 1 minute, 30 seconds. And Sachs really became the key kind of figure able to produce such animations. At the peak of the studio, there were 70 members working there, mostly very young, average age sort of 23. And alongside his work was also the work here of Peter Strausfeld, who did the posters for the Academy. Now, Strassfeld began as an animator, as well as a book illustrator. And in fact, you may know him under the name of Pendry, which is what he did his animations under. And this is just an example of some of the work that he animated for. The company was George Hollering's company. It was the Film Traders, and he was the chief animator. And he worked as an animator for that from the time he came out of internment, which I'm going to return to in a moment. So things like Peak Load, these are black and white. You can see they're really short information films that were used by the Ministry of information to engage people's attention, fast moving. Oh, that's a scene from, it's out of place. That was from the Peter Sachs previously. He also produced Skeleton in the Cupboard, which is probably one of George Hollering's most famous films that was illustrated. The animation was done by Peter Strausfeld, and just the storyline, which it's always these quirky storylines of here George the ghost, who is he's haunting an old brewery, but actually there's no beer in the brewery, and so he ends up going for a roam and sees a short animated film in the cinema, because that's where these animations were shown about the war effort. And so George goes off, gets himself, because he's a skeleton and therefore bone, very important to the war effort for all sorts of things, including ammunition. He gets himself made into ammunition and goes off to chase Hitler in Germany. So often quite kind of quirky films. Another one that is available to see online is this Tim Marches Back. You can see there again a really short black and white 1 minute 30 seconds that shows the importance of keeping the telephone lines clear for urgent calls. So there's a rich vein of animation here that appealed to the public. These were shown in cinemas. Before these animations, what was shown was live action using actors to describe the need for the war effort. But the problem with that is all sorts of things around class, around accent, dress. So in fact, animation was able to reach a public in a way that was really amusing and unexpected, absolutely delightful. And so Hallison Batchelor, Peter Sachs with Larkins and co, and Strassfield working with George Hoellering were all key animators at this time in the early 40s. Now I want to I'm just going back a bit here, because all three were interned together as enemy aliens from the summer of 1940. And they all began in the same internment camp. In the case of Strassfield and Hoellering, they were in Huyton, and then with Sachs, and then moved to Central Camp, and then moved to Onkan Camp. And I wanted to bring this into the picture because it shows something about their distinctiveness. So this is Peter Strausfeld. He had to leave Cologne because of his anti-Nazi work. He did several commissions in Cologne that still survive. These were both glass painted, but they represented they were anti the rising Nazi party. So he came to Britain in needing to escape. Amazingly, those works have survived. Like most enemy aliens, so we're dealing with here, an Austrian and two Germans, Sachs and Strassfield. They were interned during the war. And I'm showing here an image from the Onkan Pioneer, which was the camp newspaper for Onkan camp. They were both, all three of the people I'm dealing with today were first of all together in Central Camp, and then Hoellering was released actually through the intercession of Kenneth Clark to Jack Beddington, who headed the film unit, saying that they really needed him out of internment, whereas both Strassfield and Sachs didn't seem to have anybody to champion their release. Now, Strassfield, very typical illustration for the longest running internment camp magazine, the Onkan Pioneer, of Hitler's wedding, all the countries that he, where shall we have our wedding? Very biting kind of humour. And we know through Peter Sachs's work on this camp magazine that very much started out as a way for those that were interned and couldn't work to provide them with a, if you like, a sort of way of communicating. They were, of course, censored. And we know that Peter Sachs and Peter Strausfeld were together. They worked on the same magazine. One doesn't get the impression from a variety of things that they were particularly good friends together. And what Peter Sachs invented for the Onkan Pioneer was the set of homages to those that were leaving. So what you're seeing here is the homage in memory of Peter Strausfeld. You notice he inserts this question mark I in there, where he's leaving Onkan camp in the June. And we see on the right Sax's own homage to himself, leaving in the July. This was quite late to be leaving internment, and that would suggest that neither had a champion to release them in the way that George Hoellering did. And it was interesting that the reason why he came to the attention of the Ministry of Information, and the head of it at that time, was because his brother had just released a novel that was also an anti-Nazi novel. So that these three chief people that contributed to animation were in internment as enemy aliens, as German speaking. We see here, it's not a particularly wonderful image, but we see here the different, this is the last edition of the Onkan Pioneer, and you see the various people that contributed illustrations to it, like Hellering, the designer, and they were to work with him. This is Peter Sachs, this is Strassfield, and this is actually Kurt Weiler, who returned, trained by Sachs at Larkins, who returned to the to East Germany and became the chief animator there. This dialogue between internment, I wanted just to end really with this. So what we're seeing here is in Central Camp, where all three of them were. There's the famous What a Life production that was put on with Hans Gaul, the musician who wrote and composed the music, and the director and producer was Hoellering, and he was at Central. By the time, he doesn't go to Onkan because he's released by that time, but what we see in Onkan is this return again to that has been a very important production of What a Life, the story of internment, and this is Peter Sacks's kind of cover for it, showing something of the life in the camps. So it's quite extraordinary, I think, that we have coming to the UK these incredible animators and directors and producers who were interned and then went on to make such an amazing contribution to British film and animation. But of course, we know relatively little of them. They're not as famous as Hallis and Batchelor, and there's various reasons for that. Just going to quickly run back through. And some of them are that Sachs never went into commercial television or commercial film in the way Hallis and Batchelor did. And Strassfield went on to make the posters rather than he finished doing animations. Hoellering, very interesting, very relatively little research character, because he actually went on to produce numerous films, including The Murder in the Cathedral with T.S. Eliot. And so he is quite a under-researched character. So I think I'll leave it there. I'll give you an idea of how those that were considered enemy aliens then went on to play a major part in the life of Britain and in animation.
Thank you, Fran. Thank you. It's fascinating, and it takes us in so many different directions. I mean, just to sort of back up on the point about George Hoellering, when he died, Dilys Powell wrote in Sight and Sound about his being running the Academy Cinema for 36 years, and claimed that he was as important to the screen in this country as any of the great film directors. Without him, we might not have seen any of their work of those directors, and he was a gifted director in himself. And actually, I would definitely agree that he's a really interesting character who we need to come out of. Just to sort of go back in terms of, I'm sort of most familiar with Peter Sachs, really, and I think I came across his name firstly through interview with Bob Godfrey, who went on to make Rhubarb and Henry's Cat and so many other extraordinary films around that, short films, where he talked about going to get a job at the Larkin studio and being interviewed by Peter Sachs, who asked him, what he knew about animation, and he said, to be honest, absolutely nothing. And Peter Sachs says, excellent, you can start on Monday. And that was a great anecdote about Bob Godfrey, but it was also really intriguing in terms of Peter Sachs. Like, who was this guy who was looking for something different? And so I watched a number of the commercial films that he made, all these kind of sponsored documentaries. And as you say, in the immediate post-war period, they were the early ones are really quite made under austerity. They're really quite basic, black and white, very little animation, to these extraordinary films like River of Steel, Without Fear, where they had much bigger budgets. But although none of the films are some of them are extraordinary, there was some that are less successful, but in each one they tried to do something different. They just refuse to make a film that looks the same twice. And so you have Peter Sachs experiment with he's familiar with kind of sand on glass animation. You're doing that. He does it with glitter and sort of comes up with his character to sort of all these things. And he's an extraordinary character. So it was really interesting to mix with Strausfeld and Hoellering. And I just sort of ask a little bit about you sort of touch on the idea that Strausfeld and Sachs maybe didn't get on. Do you think that's because personalities were quite different, or because they were in some ways too similar? They felt almost a competition within the camp.
Yes, well, they were certainly in competition in the camp. I mean, it's very interesting because both of them, they alongside Bertram, who's another illustrator, they were the two that contributed most to the on-cam pioneer after Hellering had left, the designer. And they had very different stances though. Strassfield's background is that is one that was very anti-Nazi because of that Cologne was a curious city in the sense it had a Catholic majority and it also had communist leanings. So it was quite a tricky one for the rising Nazi party, and they really put a lot of emphasis on shutting down things there. And we see from quite early on in the surviving commissioned works that Strassfeld did that he was really very anti Hitler, and he has a kind of form of satire, political satire almost, that is there in a lot of the works that he did for On-Cam Pioneer. In fact, it's very interesting, in the On-Cam Pioneer there is a, which I didn't actually include, but there is a drawing where you have the other camp residents coming to Strassfield and saying, we like you, but we don't like your cartoons because they're quite strident. So I think they were very different temperaments. I mean, obviously, Sachs also was very anti-National Socialism. He had to leave Berlin, where he trained, moved to Eindhoven, literally on the eve of kind of war. He manages to get a sort of post as a butler with his wife, who's the maid, but that was close to the wire. But he's much more humorous and also really inventive, in the sense, as you were saying, that an opportunity for a new subject. What I didn't talk about there was the process of making of these, so that all the animation studios, and we have the records of this in the National Archive in Kew. The Ministry of Information would send out a brief sort of storyline, and then companies would put in for it, so that, for example, Sachs, just like Hallis and Batchelor would have done, and indeed Hoellering would have done. You receive a very short brief, you accept it, then you go through a process of sending in some ideas. If it's accepted, you then go through to budget. And Sachs was incredible in the sense the range that he did. So at any one time, I mean, I showed some stills there from Summer Travelling, which was, he first was commissioned for, Larkins was commissioned in the March, but then it has to be okayed through the Ministry of Information and so forth. So actually it was produced in just under 4 weeks. And at the same time, he's also doing some of the diagrams for other films like Pacific Thrust, which was a war to be able to identify war machines. And he's also working on other films, animations at the same time. So incredibly kind of busy. And it seems to me that Sachs loved, and we get a sense of this through Godfrey in interview, Vera Lineker, for example, in interview, that he was incredibly imaginative and wanted to try out new things. In a different, Strassfield did try out different things. His animations moved between a lyrical and a very incisive kind of political stance. But Sachs really relished I think that opportunity to do something new with every animation. It suited his character, obviously, very well.
Yeah,
And
there's a good, there's a good description of him in there was a profile in the, because Larkins became part of a bigger, what my boss calls a kind of a multi-headed hydra called the Film Producers Guild that dominated most of owned many of the companies producing these sort of sponsored filmmaking. And there's a profile of Sachs in one of their sort of in-house magazines where Peter insists on the label art director, but this is inadequate. Think of him as a spider, weaving the threads of ideas, words, voices, music, drawing color and continuity into the final web, which will enmesh us. So I think we're going to struggle to sort of overcome that kind of description. It's a really good, fantastic description of the ways that he brought something together. So it's interesting from to ask another Sachs question, really. It's in terms of he had this sort of prominent position that basically the films were getting bigger and bigger profile, and Larkins was getting a bigger studio into the mid 50s, and the Larkin studio fractured when commercial television came in, and some of it went off. There was a diagram unit, there was a cinema commercials unit, and there was these prestige sponsored film, which is the bit that Sachs headed, as where most of the money and the budgets were, and that bit just sort of disappeared. And it was actually a time of real growth of animation, because the industry was kind of atomized into all these little small studios, because commercial television, all you needed to do was make 30 seconds of really basic black and white animation, and you could get your stuff on telly. You could compete with Harrison Bachelor to get your material on there. And strangely, I think Sachs did try to get into commercial TV. There's a couple of sort of references in him that you can find, but he never quite made it. And so from the point of sort of running one of the two sort of prestige commercial studios in the mid 50s, by 1960, he's doing storyboards for Harrison Bachelor, and he's making sort of diagrams for combustion processes and the reduction of hemorrhage during surgery. He's kind of dropped down the pecking order quite a lot in terms of the work he's getting. And I'm wondering if there are kind of seeds that you can see that you've picked up in your research about his personality and his artistic leanings that maybe sort of lent him being less suited to the prominence of a Hallis, or having that kind of enduring career.
Yeah, he very, very interesting personality, because he was obviously extremely talented. I mean, he was able, all sides of animation he was experienced in, and that is when he came to the UK in 39 to be the butler. Yet he was one of the most accomplished, if anything from drawn animation through to trick film, you know, where I showed that image of him arranging the kind of puppets for Powell Studio. So he was a really strong all-rounder, but he wasn't really interested in, he was very sociable, he's, you know, very important for training a next generation of animators, but he wasn't interested really in the way Hallis and Bachelor was about writing about their work in the animation magazines and so forth. He was less of a publicist, and I think also television, in one way, it could be something you could be really quite spontaneous about. And it's clear from all the accounts that Peter Sachs was incredibly spontaneous about ideas for film, but he never got on with the idea of television. It was too restrictive for him. Although he did a lot of animation after leaving Larkins for.
there's a great film called For Better For Worse, which I think is on the BFI player, which has a little sequence inside that I think we can attribute to Sachs. Most of the film is designed by George Him, but there's a small sequence that's about TV that's just done in these big thick markers. I'll try and find a link to it and send it up, which is just extraordinary. But so I'll send a link up to that. So we've got some questions sort of starting to come in, and please do keep typing your questions. And the question from Joanna, in terms of, what do you think the impact of them being émigrés and coming to the country, and perhaps actually also the experience of being interned, have on an impact on their access to being able to work in the country, and then maybe sort of their enduring engagement with the UK? None of them, they all remained in the UK, didn't they?
Yeah.
So in terms of the fact of there being émigrés having an impact on their access to work during the war and post-war, perhaps.
Yeah. During the war, it was a bit double-edged. I mean, we know from accounts that there were certain, in film associations, certain worries about émigrés taking over the kind of industry. And because certainly right throughout the film industry, both theatrical cinema and commercial, that there were about sort of 400 émigrés that came in during the Second World War. But they obviously also had an ability. I think there are a couple of things there. One, on the whole, they came from an experience of animation and film studios that worked incredibly professionally in Germany, and that they knew how they ran, which was slightly different than in the UK. And then secondly, I think perhaps they had the opportunity to have a particular view of the English, a kind of quirkiness and a humour about it that they were able to use in a way that maybe they couldn't have done if they were UK born and brought up.
Just a question about the training experience that they had before they came to the UK, and you've touched on Sachs in particular working with George Powell, and that was a mix of this kind of replacement animation technique that Sachs used, but he also did cell animation as well, and he would run that studio through. So maybe we should talk just a little bit on that, but also in terms of, do we have any evidence of Strassfield being involved in any kind of filmmaking before he came to this country?
No. There was a publication in German about 6 years ago that is fascinating, because it looked at some of his surviving works in Cologne. And I mean, Strassfield trained at the Cologne work, we translate it as work school, sort of kind of technical college art school, where he worked across a whole set of media. He was expressionist in style. He worked with his master was someone called Richard Seewald, and for example, there's work in the Leicester collection of the German expressionists. His work is in there. Quite a major figure, primarily lino-cut lithograph. So we know that Strassfeld came through that. We know that he did commissions for Dominican monasteries, actually. So I presume he was Catholic rather than Jewish, although that's not stated. So until recently, it's actually been very difficult to find out material about him. But what we do know is that sentiment in his work of very virulent anti-Hitler of that time. But we have known he clearly worked as an illustrator, but not as an animator until he came here. And
Which is one of the reasons why the films are so interesting, not having that formal training. And it was interesting the example that the image you showed of the kind of the war wedding, the drawing style is really, if you watch the Tim March's Back film, you can see the way in the kinds of the woman dancing moves, that the lines are just really similar to the illustrated lines, and looking for something that's different and not doing I mean, if you think about, so I think when Sachs first came over, he was getting involved with Anson Dyer. Anson Dyer started to do war work, and that was a very traditional cell animated studio with a kind of a hierarchy of creators, and any one artist finds it very difficult to leave their sort of distinctive designs on the finished film if you're not the main one. These short little black and white films, they can be really distinctive, and you can see the fingerprints of the artist all over them, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons for wanting to show those drawings, clearly in internment, the only available outlet was magazines and drawings, is that you actually see, both with Sachs and with Strassfeld, you can see that graphic line, very, very distinctive in both of them, that is able then to sort of translate that economy of line. And also, I think there's another element that I would say links them, is that those internment magazines were very much for it was solitary, not being able to be interned, not to be able to help. These were refugees from Nazi Germany or Austria who wanted to contribute. And so there was a certain element of sort of humour in them. But I absolutely agree with you that Sachs was much more interested, and all of the people that worked with him, and I haven't really commented about that, but he trained so many people from the mid 1940s and 50s, and he wasn't looking for an animator. He was looking for somebody who had a smart line and a view of the world.
We could just talk a little bit about the politics. I mean, Hoellering sort of produced Kula Vampa, didn't he, based on the Bertolt Brecht script? And you talked about Strassfeld sort of having some communist leanings, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Were these sort of continuing legacy in their careers? And do you think that is there sort of evidence of that in the post-war period is something that kind of brought them together? And we sort of we talked about the little previously to this, but in terms of Sachs's politics being quite hard to define in some ways, and whether that is any contributing factor.
Yeah, because both Hoellering and Strassfeld shared this, and it's not to say Sachs didn't have this, but those two in particular shared a lot of anger about the Germany that they were leaving, being forced to leave. And I haven't really mentioned, but I mean, Hollering's fascinating character, because if you look back, I mean, he's Viennese born, but he works in Berlin. I've no evidence that he knew Sachs in Berlin in the early 1920s, but they were both there at that time. Then he returns to Vienna after having produced this film that you mentioned, which we translate as "Who Owns the World?" And really, it was censored at the time. It was seen as left-wing, savage film. It was about unemployment in the Weimar Republic. And then he goes to Hungary and makes that absolutely haunting film of Hortobani, which is, if you ever get a chance, you can see it actually sort of online. And that's about the herdsmen, nomadic herdsmen of Hungary. And again, that actually he got into trouble with the censors for that, because it wasn't regarded as a kind of view of Hungary that they wanted. And so he then leaves, and the writing's very much on the wall for him. So in his work, that element comes through, I think, even in the UK, and the same with Strassfeld. I mean, some of his illustrations are very biting attacks. What I haven't mentioned is yet another side of Strassfield, which as a book illustrator, he used the name of his English-born wife of Pendry, but so alongside these films, which sometimes it can be, they go between that lyrical, as I said, and a really harsh view. He's also producing children's books, quite magical, from 1946. So quite a complicated character. Whereas Sachs, now we do know that Sachs was obviously, he had to leave Germany, he had to leave Holland, but he spoke less of that. He kind of just didn't dwell upon it. Different kind of personality, I think, or wanting to kind of move on.
I think we've. If anybody's got any more questions, we've got time for maybe one more. But there's so many things that kind of have come out of this and link between them, and there is that sort of, there was a decade between. Hoellering was the older figure, wasn't he? He was about 10, sort of 12 years older than both of them, and I do find it intriguing, the kind of the relationship between these two competing young Turks for his kind of attention, really, and Strassfield sort of having this long continuing relationship with them, and Sachs kind of going out on his own. He's a really interesting figure that I encourage people, and hopefully we can make more of his films and his story available over the years, because his impact, that you've talked about him as a sort of teacher and legacy, and just sort of Bob Godfrey's one of those figures, but another one is Richard Taylor, who sort of went through like his studio and talked a lot about him. And if you're not familiar with Richard Taylor's name, you're familiar with his work, because he's the guy who did the Charlie Says Little Cat and Boy public information films, are kind of absolutely completely iconic. And Dick Taylor is probably the one who had the biggest picked up the legacy of Sachs in the most, and he always tried something different in different films. He tried to draw his characters a different way. Can I get away without outlines? Do I need a neck? Who needs a neck when you're animating? And the vlogs, and that just kind of that experimental spirit, it's there, and it comes across in Bob Godfrey, just saying, right, I'm just going to use magic markers to do rhubarb. I'm going to just get the basics. I'm going to use cutout. I'm going to try different ways, and I don't need 25 drawings to make this joke funny. I just need 1 and 2 and a punchline. And this is all the kind of legacies of Sachs and probably in some ways their improvised background, and the way that they did sort of scrabble these films out of very little in the post-war period. Do you have any, if we haven't got any other questions, do you have any information about them, any kind of correspondence between these three in the post-war period? And presumably, if you haven't, then it's a call out if anybody ever finds some.
No, there isn't.
Beyond the connection between Strassfeld and Hoellering, obviously, who are working together.
Yeah, no, I don't. And I think definitely within internment, they were in competition. I've no sense that they were friends, although Strassfeld's life ran in parallel to Sax's. They inhabited slightly different worlds, I think. I mean, Sachs, you talk about the way in which Sachs was much more a sort of, he was inventive, and he saw himself as an artist rather than perhaps as a designer, as lots of people would place him, and he always put an emphasis on the artistic side, and as a studio, that it was like that. And so one sees that very clearly in any correspondence with Larkins and the studio, and say, you know, there's letters in the Tate that point to that. I think what you get a sense of is also they formed very strong relationships with musicians, composers. In the case of Sachs, it's with the Emigré, Francis Chagrin, who produced, you know, tremendous amount. Whereas, for example, Hallison Batchelor, it's with Mayer, who's the link there. So it's very, very interesting. I think they moved in very different circles. And of course, Sachs remained in London. I didn't go into that, but Strassfeld moved to Brighton and taught there and so forth later. So I don't think they inhabited the same kind of worlds, although everyone must have thought of them together.
No, I think just the fact that Sax's last credit on a film is as an advisor on a Goldsmiths College film by a student there called Take It Away from 1979, and basically his credits all dry up, and it's a very intriguing. I'm sure he worked on a lot of things, but so much of that kind of work was uncredited. But it's been a fascinating insight into the three, and I hope that you continue researching them and fleshing out this story and inspire others to do it. So a huge thanks, Fran, and I'm going to hand back to Monica to end off the evening. Thank you.
Could I just say though, but also we're looking forward immensely, because you've got a volume coming out next year on is that right? On
yes, in theory. So I will have a book called The Story of British Animation coming out next year through BFI Bloomsbury. It's part of a new series, and don't expect if you drop it, your feet are going to be fine. It's not the thickest volume. It's a gallop through the history, but hopefully it starts to bring some of these stories together, and we're hoping to have over 100 colour illustrations in there. So that's going through its final bits of proof, and will be out hopefully spring next year, which is a vague, long period, but let's assume we're all here next year. Fingers crossed. So look out for that, and your feet are safe. But it's been interesting to write, and it just shows how much is left to be researched and written, and quite what extraordinary stories that there are in British animation history, and what extraordinary figures there are, and each one is probably worth a book almost itself. So thank you, Fran, for bringing that up, and over to you, Monica.
With great pleasure. Before I round things up, I'd like perhaps, if I may, just to ask one very basic but I think important question, which hasn't really been touched on enough perhaps, and that is, perhaps it's a question for you, Jez, above all, you know, the state of British animation before the émigrés arrived in this country. Can you kind of provide a context for which enables us to kind of assess the level of their innovation and their originality? Because clearly
in some ways, I guess,
talents.
You have kind of pre-war émigrés as well. You have Len Lai coming from New Zealand. You have Lottie Reiniger coming from Germany. You have Norman McLaren coming from Scotland.
Are you saying then that, you know, the British world of British animation really exists only because of émigrés from different contexts, perhaps? Or
no, I'm certainly not saying that, but I'm saying it's always certainly has been a huge fundamental factor, and that the baton that Sachs and Larkins picked up was certainly the one that was set by, particularly by the GPO film unit and Grierson, thinking, okay, commercial films can be art films. Commercial art can really push the boundaries and be a real playground for artists, and that is certainly something that Sachs and others and Hallis picked up the baton on, and is maybe something that is there and continues to this day. I mean, the extraordinary kind of commercial work that's going out as viral videos and all kinds of things today. This is the backbone of our animation industry, and everything else has never really made so much money. People have made other things, thankfully, they've made other products, but it's been the financial backbone, and it has produced these extraordinary works. So it's an environment that has suited other perspectives, because their aesthetics in the background have been different, and the work has stood out for that. So in some ways, I think the industry that we has attracted different thinkers and different minds, and people from different perspectives. And so maybe the idea of coming from overseas and Emigré gives you a chance to a head start on establishing yourself. And so it's, yeah, I think it's sort of picking up that baton has been really interesting.
Good. There's obviously so much more to be found out, isn't there? And I think that's actually the mark of a really good session, that there's many questions as answers. I'm particularly intrigued, I have to say, by George Hoellering, who I sort of come across as somebody behind the scenes at the Academy Cinema, which I must confess I remember fondly from my own growing up in London. But also one thing you didn't mention, I don't know whether either of you can throw any light on this, is his quite seminal role in the founding of the ICA. So he's clearly a very interesting figure.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah, and he did that amazing film, which you can watch online, of Shape and Line, which was for Penrose did an exhibition at the ICA, 40,000 years of art, and it's said that they did that film in the bottom of the Academy in the basement overnight, having filmed things obviously in situ in the ICA. And it's really, I mean, it's 1950, 50, I'm going to say, possibly 51, but it's one of the most important films, both in terms of the ICA and seeing the ICA at that time, but also the range of artists that were involved in it. And that's a really significant. And there are lots of other things that he's done. He was obviously a key, important linker. He was also a BFI, he was on the board of the BFI.
Yes.
Right. I wonder if anybody in the audience is actually doing any research on Hellering, or knows of anybody who is, because clearly we ought to know about it. Perhaps they'd like to make themselves known, if anybody can throw any further light on this clearly rather, sort of elusive and actually really important figure.
Yeah.
Anyway, do come forward if you would like to. Perhaps indeed we should round up now. And what I'd like to do, if I may, is pick up on a few of the topics that have been touched on in terms of Insiders Outsiders events. First of all, somebody asked straight away whether the event is being recorded. Yes, it is. And the plan is to upload it in the next few days, certainly within the week, onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel that you can access simply by typing in Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, and it's proving to be quite a valuable repository, though I say it myself, of recordings of past events and events to come in the next 10 days or so. So do look out for that. I will also, can't resist really putting in a plug for other events in the next week or so to do with internment. Now, the whole question of internment and the creative life of the British internment camps, mostly but not exclusively on the Isle of Man, which is something that, in fact, most of you probably do know, but wasn't actually mentioned, is an increasingly fascinating one to me, and again, ripe for further discovery. There is actually tomorrow evening at 6 going to be an event that ties in with this. It's somebody called Nancy Greenspan, who some of you may have heard last time round in the summer, talking about Klaus Fuchs, and where she mentioned his internment both in Huyton but also in Canada. And on this occasion, tomorrow, she's going to be talking exclusively about the internment of predominantly Jewish refugees from Nazism in Canada, which, well, I think in Canada itself is a subject that's deeply neglected and certainly barely known about in this country. So I would urge you, if you'd like to pursue the internment topic, to listen in, to register for that event. And then on the 4th of November, picking up that sort of important thread, and please perhaps, again, many of you will know, this year is the 80th anniversary of the so-called, the enemy aliens being interned by the British government in the wake of the phony war. There was panic, a fear of a fifth column in their ranks. I mean, doesn't really make sense in retrospect, but the fear was, I think, at the time quite genuine. Anyway, on the 4th of November, the last evening of this particular program of events, there are going to be 2 events, one by a presentation by Yvonne Cresswell, who is a very knowledgeable curator at the Manx National Heritage in Douglas on the Isle of Man, who will be talking about the rich archival resources at researchers' disposal, which again, many people here in this, on the mainland don't properly know about. And then she'll be followed by a presentation by members of the so-called Russian Heritage Trust, who have been recently doing their best to research the history specifically of the women internees, which again is a much neglected subject. So look out for those. I should also just end by saying that the Hallison Bachelor event, to which I alluded at the beginning, that took place on the 23rd of July this year, is on the YouTube channel. And also going back to Hoellering and his role as a producer of What a Life, the satirical review that took place in Douglas, in the first round of events during Refugee Week, in other words, in June, again on the YouTube channel, was a wonderful event by Norbert Mein in particular, who's a music specialist, talking about Hans Gall and his work, particularly in internment. So once again, fascinating connections. It all intertwines and connects, doesn't it, in truly interesting ways. So thank you very much, Fran and Jez, a really fascinating session. Many, many thanks. And thank everybody for coming, for being here. I wish I could say for coming, for listening in. All the very best. And lots of nice thank yous coming in.
Never had so many people in our bedroom before.
Thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.